the Kremlin actually quite insistent on its original premises. The first time the President Zelensky and President Trump met, there seems to have been some misunderstanding about the U.S. commitment to supplying, continuously supplying weapons to Ukraine. Today, there is a little bit more common ground for mutual understanding. But there's a little bit of hope now that indeed this could lead somewhere that is acceptable for both parties, most importantly, Ukraine. The issue is always the willingness of both parties to negotiate a ceasefire. Basically, at this point, we're around 4 in these negotiations when the U.S. administration outreaches to the Kremlin, becomes optimistic about what's promised, but then it turns out that the Kremlin actually quite insistent on its original premises. And the previous time, like the first time the President Zelensky and President Trump met, there seems to have been some misunderstanding about the U.S. commitment to supplying, continuously supplying weapons to Ukraine, what this war meant for European security, and in general, Zelensky's willingness to agree certain to certain concessions that the Kremlin insisted on. I think today there is a little bit more common ground for mutual understanding. And well, at least the President Trump claims that the Kremlin, based on the Alaska meeting that took place between President Trump and Putin on Friday, is willing to actually also make certain concessions, including allegedly more robust security guarantees for Ukraine, certain constitutional changes for Russia, sort of claiming not to violate Ukraine's borders in the future. Most importantly, perhaps Western military deployment inside of Ukraine as the basis for future security guarantees that I think is of most interest to Ukrainian president, since this would be an alternative to the Article 5 in NATO, which is a non-starter at this point, but nonetheless probably would deter Putin more effectively than many other alternatives, in case the Kremlin agrees to this. And this is the major issue that's still vague. We don't have a lot of clarity, given that there is no very clear indication from the Kremlin as to whether indeed this is acceptable. In the past, there's also some resistance from the Western allies to send troops on the ground in Ukraine, since potentially this can risk major escalation with Russia if Russia was to violate its previous agreement, as it did in the past. So there's a lot of ambiguity here, but there's a little bit of hope now that indeed this could lead somewhere that is acceptable for both parties, most importantly Ukraine in this situation, because Ukraine obviously facing an existential threat from Russia consistently. Any Russia's claims, verbal, promises of certain guarantees at this point are completely unreliable, given that the Kremlin has repeatedly violated them in the past, and Ukraine is completely right to be very, very skeptical about any such promises. In addition, I will flag that based on our own analysis at CSIS and the situation on the front line, the Kremlin has a little bit of leeway still, right? As we speak, they keep pushing further into Ukraine, occupying very slowly, but nonetheless consistently small villages, additional square miles on the ground in Ukraine. And economically, they're not great. They're potentially facing imminent recession, but nonetheless, this is also not a catastrophic situation for them. So that realization, that's very clear for everybody involved, sort of raises some, I think, justified skepticism as to how legitimately, how honest the Kremlin is really in these promises, given that potentially the real goal may be just to procrastinate this conversation, offering vague promises. Notice how President Trump has shifted from his original impetus on immediate ceasefire to now claiming that we need to negotiate a long-term peace agreement. This is actually something that Putin was promising from the start, and this is certainly concerning for everyone involved on the Ukrainian side, given that this potentially is what the Kremlin is trying to achieve, try to prolongate these talks. There's no point in a ceasefire. Let's talk about this major peace deal. In the meantime, Putin is gaining time to allow him to keep pushing on the ground in Ukraine and hope in the expectation that Ukrainian frontline will eventually collapse. the bar is pretty low given the what we've seen in February, but indeed today's meeting seems to between President Zelensky and President Trump seems to have gone on a far more positive note, friendlier, some jokes exchanged, and hopefully some expectation of more mutual, basically more shared ground, more ground